Thanks, Stephen. Investors have reportedly been dumping South African government bonds at a rate of almost 2 billion rand a day in August, according to JSE Ltd data compiled by Bloomberg, with issuance increasing and a downgrade to junk a looming possibility. Non-residents have sold a net of 14.4 billion rand of the debt in August so far. That's an average of 1.8 billion rand a day. And joining us now to discuss this is Isaah Mhlanga, economist at Alexander Forbes. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. So what do you think is the reason for this? And even though some are saying that our bonds have been amongst the best performing in developing nations.
From a real return point of view, yes, they are one of the best performing. But if you look at global factors, you have the US yield curve inverting. You also have 16 trillion of global debt that is now negative yielding, which means investors invest in those bonds knowing that if they hold until maturity, they're going to get less than what they invested, which means they're preferring safety and liquidity over chasing returns. So they are concerned about something. What is that something? Concerns about global economic growth, potentially a U.S. recession, particularly if you look at the yield curve inverting. It has preceded 7 out of 7 past U.S. recessions. So it is an indicator that has been quite accurate in predicting U.S. recessions. So if you also look locally, the bailout of state-owned companies have increased our fiscal risks. And as a result, you saw Fitch Rating Agency changing the outlook from stable to negative, which means the likelihood of a Moody's changing the outlook come October is very high, and potentially a credit rating downgrade come 2020, which means investors are already anticipating potential downgrade from Moody's. So both global and local factors are negative.
Okay, so we'll look at the local factors in just a moment. So that assessment is going to be made in November. So are we anticipating that the worst scenario is downgrading to junk status?
That is the worst scenario, but I wouldn't expect an outright downgrade. Remember, the outlook is still at stable. They'll have to change the outlook to negative first, if they follow what they've done historically before they downgrade outright. So expect a downgrade in 2020, not necessarily at the October MTBPS.
But what would be behind then that dumping of SA bonds at 2 billion rand a day since the beginning of August? And surely those sales would have also wiped out the inflows.
It's not just a South Africa phenomenon. You see it in many other emerging markets. When foreign investors see increasing risks of a global recession, they normally take their money out of risky assets, which include emerging market currencies, emerging market bonds, into safe haven assets, which include your developed markets bonds. So you see it in the likes of Brazil, in the likes of Russia. It's not just South Africa.
But you're not seeing it in Argentina. Why is that?
Well, you see it in Argentina,
but
actually.
Not at this level.
Not at this level, but Argentina, remember, they have defaulted on their bonds already in 2018. And if you look at their currency, it's close to 50. It was about 45 to the US dollar, which means it's much weaker than South Africa is. It's not an economy that you would compare with South Africa. It's much more worse. It's coming from a lower base. Its yields, because it had to increase interest rate quite dramatically in order to stem those capital outflows. So its yields are relatively very high compared to where South Africa's yields are.
So you spoke about some of the internal factors, and we've increased our local currency debt by something like 37%, just looking at the last week alone. You mentioned the SOEs. Is Eskom largely to blame?
To a large extent, Eskom contributes, to this negative news. The bailouts that were given to Eskom, plus other SOEs, but the majority of it is Eskom. Over 281 billion in guaranteed debt by the National Treasury, which means that is the debt that would be required to be paid by Treasury if Eskom fails to pay or to service the debt to investors. But I think there are other factors as well. Economic growth is now lower, which means to what National Treasury was focusing at the beginning of the year, and the expected revenues that they were going to collect in taxes are now going to be lower as well. If you also look at tax buoyancy, which is how much tax they will collect for every rand in economic growth, they overestimated tax buoyancy of about 1.33. If you look over the past 3 years, they have managed to collect less than R1 of that, which means they overestimated. Come October, you are likely to see a significant revenue underperformance, which means you have to either cut spending to remain within the same estimates, or you increase your borrowing in order to fund the fiscal deficit.
And speaking of that, then I'm watching at home and I'm thinking, what does this whole dumping of SA bonds mean? And if we're talking about us increasing our debt level, surely that should mean a widening of the budget deficit. How is that going to impact me, the ordinary man on the street?
If the budget deficit increases, you have to either fund it or cut spending. Or if you cut spending, it means there's less money to spend on education, there's less money to spend on health, there's less money to increase wages of people that work for public sector. If you don't do that, it means you have to increase your borrowing, and increasing your borrowing only means future taxes have to go up in order to fund those borrowings in future. So you are essentially increasing the debt burden or the tax burden for future generations just to fulfill the current generation's exorbitant spending pressures.
I mean, we've been listening to the Reserve Bank governor speaking to Francis earlier on, and he was speaking about the fact that we can't afford as a country, to go to the IMF, because he would see that as ultimately a sign that we've lost faith in our economic policies, but it would be a bad decision. But more importantly, he spoke about us ensuring that the excesses of this generation does not impact on the next generation. So for those who are concerned on the excessive amount, which some see as being ploughed into Eskom, does it fall within that category?
It does, but I think just to touch on the issue of perhaps approaching the IMF, it's a little bit too sensationalist for now to expect or to even talk about South Africa going to the IMF. You need a banking crisis, which a country cannot deal with. You need a balance of payments crisis, which means you can't pay for your imports, or you can't service your foreign debt for you to approach the IMF. Or you need a funding problem, which means from your local bond markets, you cannot access the funding that you require. We don't have any of those three. If you look at our total debt portfolio, only about 10% is in foreign currency. If you look at the banking sector, they have been quite conservative in terms of where do they borrow money from. They have low levels of foreign currency denominated debt, which means we don't have an issue of funding from foreign investors. So we don't have any of the typical characteristics that would make countries to go to the IMF. So we are still way too far. But
so
that is not to say that our economy is not in crisis. We have way too low levels of economic growth such that unemployment continues to increase, which is what is felt by the men on the street.
So if we talk about what we obviously originally we started with this conversation, the flight of capital, especially by foreign investors, is it something that could be a knee-jerk reaction, and is it priced into the market at the moment? Because I'm wondering, does it mean that if this continues, the shedding of the bonds, that we could actually see ourselves removed from investment-grade indexes?
It is potentially front-running that downgrade. It's already priced in to a large extent, but not fully priced in. You would expect some $3 billion of outflows when the actual downgrade takes place, because there are a lot of fund managers that invest, because South Africa is still included in the City World Government Bond Index, which requires our debt to be investment grade. Once we lose that investment grade, they will be forced to sell. But there are a lot of investors that chase a higher real yield who do not require a country to be rated investment grade, which means, yes, we'll see an initial outflows, but we will see those outflows coming back, because they will be chasing yield, because once you get downgraded, your yields go up, which means it becomes even more competitive for foreign investors to invest in our debt. So typically, you see over a 12-month period an improvement in bond yields, an improvement in currencies after a country has lost investment grade.
So should November roll around and we experience a downgrade, how do I, as a consumer, insulate myself from that? Do I start paying off my debts, and especially my high interest debts, or do I save more? Which do I focus my energies on?
I think should have been doing that already. The effects of a weakening economy has been felt by a lot of households out there for quite some time, a lot of people losing jobs. But typically, you should not be borrowing more, which means don't increase your debt, but also pay off your loans, increase the repayments that you make. An extra 1,000 rand or an extra even 500 rand will reduce the term over which you pay off your loan.
And I'd imagine that would be your main assets, like your bond loan, for instance, that you would plow more money into that.
Absolutely, but also you have to shop. When you buy your groceries, you have to look at cheaper options rather than just to go directly to the more expensive. So make some substitute that reduces the amount of cost.
And keeping a cool head in the midst of all of this news, negativity of panic, is that also important, as in not to panic and stick to your plan?
No, absolutely. I think that helps quite a lot. But if you look more broadly, there is nothing much that the men on the street can do, because the cost of living is just going to go up over time. But we don't expect an outright downgrade in November.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your insights. Isaah Mhlanga is economist at Alexander Forbes.